The combine was still running when they found her truck. It was the first week of October 1994, and in the fields around Calvert, Nebraska, the corn harvest was at its peak. That narrow, relentless window when every farmer in Custer County was running equipment from first light until the cold came down and shut them off for the night. Nobody noticed a truck parked at the edge of the Hendershot Access Road at 8 in the morning, because trucks sat at the edges of access roads during harvest. That was what trucks did. It blended into the machinery of the season, the way everything did when the corn was coming in, and the air smelled of turned earth and diesel, and the whole county was too busy to look up. It was Walt Dreisbach's boy, 14-year-old Kevin, driving his father's pickup on a parts run to town, who finally slowed down and looked. The truck had been there since he'd gone out at dawn. It was still there at noon. The engine was off. The door was closed. The keys were in it. He knew whose truck it was. By 12:15, Kevin Dreisbach had turned around and driven home fast and told his father. By 12:40, Walt had called the Custer County Sheriff's Office. By 1 o'clock, 2 deputies were standing at the edge of the Hendershot Access Road looking at an empty red pickup that belonged to Judith Callan, 51 years old, third-generation wheat and corn farmer, widow, mother of 2, and the most reliably early riser in a county full of early risers. Nobody could find her. What that truck sitting at the edge of a Nebraska harvest field meant would take 30 years to finally say out loud. To understand what Judith Callan meant to Calvert, you have to understand what Calvert was. Population 1,900 in the 1990 census, though the actual number was probably closer to 1,600 by 1994. The kind of slow leak that small agricultural towns across the Great Plains were experiencing as young people left for Lincoln and Omaha and didn't come back. Calvert had a grain elevator, a co-op, a Lutheran church, a Catholic church, a diner called Gertz that opened at 5:30 in the morning, because that was when the farmers needed coffee, and a single-screen movie theater that showed films about 3 weeks after everywhere else did, and charged $3 for a ticket and $2 for a Coke. It sat in the middle of Custer County, which sat in the middle of Nebraska, which sat in the middle of the country, and felt precisely that way, at the center of something large and important and mostly invisible to the people who lived elsewhere. Judith had been born on the Callan farm in 1943. She had gone to the University of Nebraska in Lincoln, gotten a degree in agricultural science, and come back to run the farm alongside her husband Dennis, who had died of a heart attack in the cab of his tractor in the summer of 1988 at 51 years old, while the wheat was coming in. The farm might reasonably have broken after that. It did not. Judith Callan put the farm in her own name, renegotiated the equipment leases, hired a seasonal hand to cover what Dennis had done, and kept the operation running without interruption. She was 51 years old in October 1994. She had 2 adult children, her son Michael, who ran a farm supply business in Kearney, and her daughter Renee, who taught 2nd grade in Calvert and lived 6 miles from the farm. She had 420 acres of corn and winter wheat. She had a dog named Gus, a thick-necked yellow lab who slept on the porch in good weather and inside by the furnace in bad. She had a CB radio in the truck and a Citizens Band call sign that every farmer in the county knew, and she used it every morning to pass along weather observations and road conditions in the flat, unhurried voice of a woman who understood that information was a form of community service. She was the kind of person a community does not know it is organized around until she is gone. She drove a 1991 red Chevy pickup that was visible from a long way off across a flat landscape, which was, she had told Renee once, not an accident. She liked being seen. She liked knowing that the people around her knew where she was and what she was doing, because she felt the same way about them. That was how a farm community worked. not just in the commercial sense of shared equipment and mutual labor, but in the deeper sense of a set of people who had chosen, by staying, to be responsible for one another. She had been planning to finish the North Field by the end of that week. On the morning of October 7th, 1994, Renee had called the farmhouse at 6:15 to ask about the frost warning the previous night. Judith answered, told her the North Field had come through fine, said she was heading out early, said she'd call that evening. She never called. By 10 o'clock that night, Renee was in her car driving to the farm. By 11, she was calling the county sheriff. The next morning, Kevin Dreisbach slowed down and looked at a red truck that had been there since dawn, and the North Field stood unharvested, the corn drying in the October wind, the combine silent for the first time in a week. The Custer County Sheriff at the time was a man named Dale Przybylski, 16 years in the office, known throughout the county for the systematic thoroughness that had made him the kind of sheriff people re-elected without much discussion. He drove out to the Hendershot Access Road himself when the call came in. The truck told a story that didn't make sense in a simple way. There were no signs of mechanical trouble. The gas tank was 3/4 full. The CB radio was on, volume turned low, but switched to channel 19, the agricultural channel, the channel Judith monitored every morning. Her work gloves were on the passenger seat. Her thermos, still warm when the deputies checked at 1 o'clock, was in the cup holder. She had not intended to stop here long. Sheriff Przybylski organized a search that afternoon and expanded it through the weekend. Neighbors, volunteer firefighters, the county's soil conservation service workers who knew every drainage ditch and windbreak on every quarter section for 30 miles in any direction. They covered the fields adjacent to the access road. They covered the tree lines. They checked the creek beds. They found nothing. On the western shoulder of the access road, 40 yards south of the truck, a set of tire tracks was pressed into the soft earth at the edge of the gravel, wide, commercial grade, consistent with a 3/4 ton or larger pickup or utility vehicle. The tracks had been partially obscured by the passage of harvest equipment during the search, but what remained was cast and photographed. Along the fence line running east from that same spot, deputies found a torn length of blue billing twine, the kind used throughout the county, sold at every farm supply store from Kearney to North Platte. Pressed into the soft soil beside the bottom fence wire was a partial boot print, large, deep-toed work boot, left foot, pressed as though the wearer had been leaning forward over the fence line. A soil sample was collected around the boot print. The baling twine was bagged. Neither produced anything conclusive with the technology available in 1994. One detail went into the case file and stayed there. A neighbor named Glenn Teague, who farmed the quarter section immediately north of the Hendershot Road, mentioned to a deputy that he had seen an unfamiliar dark green utility vehicle. Older model, he thought. Maybe a Suburban or a Blazer. Parked near the access road entrance 2 mornings in a row the week before Judith disappeared. He hadn't thought anything of it at the time. Harvest season brought extra traffic. He thought something of it now. But he hadn't gotten the plate. And he couldn't say for certain what day it had been. And by the time investigators tried to pursue the vehicle, the harvest traffic had made that particular memory essentially impossible to verify. 2 names came to the attention of the investigation in the weeks that followed. The first was a farm equipment dealer from Broken Bow named Curtis Fall, who had been involved in a bitter dispute with Judith over a failed equipment lease earlier that year. A dispute that had escalated to letters from attorneys and, according to one witness, a loud confrontation in the parking lot of Gert's Diner in August. But Foley had been in Omaha at a trade show the week Judith disappeared, a fact documented by hotel records, a conference registration, and a dozen colleagues who'd sat with him at dinner 3 nights running. He was eliminated. The second name surfaced more quietly. A man named Darren Voss had done custom harvest contracting work across Custer County for several seasons, running a crew that moved from farm to farm during the September and October harvest windows. He was 43 years old, originally from Ord, Nebraska. No permanent address to speak of during harvest season. He moved with the work. He drove a dark green Chevy Suburban, mid-1980s model. Sheriff Przybylski spoke with Voss in mid-October. Voss stated that he had been contracted to work 2 farms in the county during the first week of October and named them. Both farmers confirmed his presence on their properties. But neither could account for every hour of every day, and custom harvest contractors moved constantly, from farm to farm, field to field, the edges of their schedules always saw. Voss was calm in the interview. He expressed appropriate concern. He had no criminal record in Nebraska, though a records check eventually turned up a misdemeanor harassment charge in South Dakota from 1989 that had been resolved without conviction. It wasn't enough. By the spring of 1995, the investigation had reached a wall. Judith Callan had not been found. No charges had been filed. The case was reclassified as inactive. Renee Callan Marsh, who had been teaching 2nd grade in Calvert when her mother disappeared and was still teaching 2nd grade in Calvert 15 years later, made a call to the Custer County Sheriff's Office every October. The current sheriff, Przybylski, had retired in 2003, was always courteous. The case, she was told each time, remained open. She always said thank you. She always hung up and sat for a moment at her kitchen table before she went back to whatever she had been doing. The years moved the way they do in flat country, wide and slow, and hard to mark at the edges. By 2000, the Callan farm had been sold. Michael and Renee had held onto it for 5 years, renting the acreage to a neighboring operation. But the weight of managing land at a distance while the case remained open had become something they could not sustain indefinitely. The sale felt like a loss compounded on a loss. Neither of them talked about it much. The dog Gus had died in the spring of 1996. Renee had buried him near the windbreak on the north side of the farm, the direction Judith had always said had the best light in the morning. By the time the farm changed hands, that windbreak was on someone else's property, and Renee could not visit it without asking permission. For years she did not ask. Eventually, she stopped thinking about asking. Dale Przybylski had retired to a place outside of Broken Bow and taken up fishing with the deliberate patience of a man who had spent 4 decades making things happen and was now studying how to let them. He kept Judith Callan's case file in a binder on a shelf in his study. He had organized it himself, neatly, the way he organized everything. He did not look at it often. He did not get rid of it. By 2010, the reward poster that had once been taped in the window of Gert's Diner had been replaced by a laminated card tacked to the community board just inside the door. Smaller. But there. The diner itself was under new management. Had been since 2004. But the new owner had kept the card when Renee quietly asked her to. She knew what it meant even if she didn't know all of it. In 2015, Darren Voss was 59 years old and had settled, permanently now, in a small town in central Kansas called Pratt. He owned a house there. He did odd jobs, equipment repair, seasonal contracting, the kind of itinerant skilled work that kept him in modest comfort without attracting attention. His neighbors in Pratt found him agreeable in a contained sort of way. He sat on the porch in the evenings sometimes. He waved when people drove past. He had not returned to Nebraska since 2001. Every case on this channel represents weeks of research, digging through records, verifying facts, and piecing together real lives that deserved better. If you want us to keep uncovering the truth behind stories like this one, take a second to like this video and subscribe. Drop a comment and tell us where in the world you're watching from. Your support is what makes this possible. Now, let's get back to Judith. Then, in the autumn of 2022, the Nebraska State Patrol's Cold Case Unit received a new allocation of state funding designated specifically for forensic reanalysis of biological evidence in unsolved cases from before 2005. There were 47 cases on the review list. The Callan file was number 12. The evidence box had been in the Custer County Evidence Archive for 28 years. When the Cold Case Unit analyst, a woman named Tran, who had been doing cold case forensic review for 4 years and approached every evidence inventory with the focused attention of someone who understood that the difference between a solved case and an unsolved one was often a single overlooked item. Went through the Callan box item by item, she found it on the third pass. Inside a secondary evidence envelope, catalogued as item 14B, was a soil collection from around the boot print near the Hendershot fence line. Attached to the envelope was a notation in the original deputy's handwriting that read, "Possible organic material, surface of print margin, not identified." Not submitted. The material had never been tested. Tran submitted it for DNA extraction. After 3 weeks of laboratory processing, a partial male profile was recovered from microscopic biological residue in the soil, shed skin cells, most likely, deposited when the wearer's boot pressed into the earth and compressed the surface. The profile was partial, insufficient for a traditional CODIS database search, but sufficient, barely, for investigative genetic genealogy. Investigative genetic genealogy takes a partial DNA profile from crime scene evidence and uploads it to voluntary public ancestry databases, the same platforms where millions of people have submitted their own genetic information to trace their family histories and find distant relatives. By identifying partial matches and painstakingly building family trees outward from those matches, analysts can narrow the field of possible contributors from thousands of people to dozens, and then from dozens to one. It is slow, methodical work. It requires genealogical expertise as much as forensic expertise, and it depends entirely on the accident of whether someone genetically related to the unknown contributor has chosen to register their DNA with a public database. In the case of Darren Voss, his younger brother had. In 2019, the brother, who lived in Minnesota and had no contact with Darren for years, had submitted a consumer DNA kit as a Christmas gift to himself. Curious about a family story that their grandfather had been part Scandinavian, he had gotten his results, noted them with interest, and moved on. Tran's analysis produced his profile as a partial match in December 2022. She built the family tree from that branch. It took 11 weeks. In March 2023, she had a name. She did not rush. She verified. She extended the tree in 2 additional directions to confirm convergence. When she was certain, she called her supervisor. She said, "I have a name on the Callan case." Nebraska State Patrol investigators conducted a covert DNA collection from Darren Voss in Pratt, Kansas in May 2023. A discarded water bottle from a parking lot outside a hardware store where Voss had been seen on a Tuesday morning. The sample was submitted for direct comparison against the profile from the soil. It matched. The partial DNA profile recovered from a compressed boot print in Nebraska farm soil in October 1994 belonged to Darren Voss. One of the lead investigators called Dale Przybilski at his place outside Broken Bow on a Thursday afternoon. Przybilski was 76 years old. He was sitting on the back porch with a cup of coffee, watching the light come across the flat ground the way light does in Nebraska in the late afternoon in spring, low and gold and patient. His wife heard him on the phone for a long time. When he came inside, she looked at him. He set down his cup. He said, "They got him." She did not have to ask who. Darren Voss was 72 years old when Kansas Bureau of Investigation agents, working in coordination with the Nebraska State Patrol, arrived at his house in Pratt at 6:50 in the morning on June 4, 2023. He had lived on that block for 8 years. He knew his neighbors by name. He kept his yard clean. He attended, on occasion, a non-denominational church 2 streets over, whose pastor described him later as a quiet man who seemed to be looking for something he hadn't found yet. He had no close friends that anyone could identify. He had no family nearby. He had, for 28 years, kept his own company in the methodical, undemonstrative way of a man who had learned that the best camouflage was routine. The agents knocked at 6:50. Voss came to the door in work pants and a flannel shirt, already dressed. He looked at the agents and at the vehicle, at the curb, and at the Nebraska State Patrol insignia on the jacket of the officer standing behind them. He was quiet for a moment. Then he stepped back from the door and said he needed to get his boots. They let him get his boots. He was transported to Pratt County custody and subsequently extradited to Nebraska, where he was arraigned on charges of first-degree murder in the death of Judith Ann Callan in Custer County District Court. The news reached Calvert the way such news does, fast and fractured. The details arriving before the confirmation. The confirmation arriving before people had finished absorbing the details. Renee Callan Marsh, who was 64 years old and still teaching, she had moved to a different grade level, but she had never left the school. Heard it from the principal, who had seen it on his phone during lunch. She sat in the teacher's lounge for a long time after the other teachers cleared out. Then, she called her brother Michael in Kearney. Michael Collin was 67. He had not cried about his mother in many years. Not because he had finished grieving, but because at a certain point, grief becomes the water you live in, rather than a thing that happens to you. He sat in his truck in the parking lot of his own business and held the phone against his chest for a while after Renee said what she had called to say. Glenn Teague, who had told a deputy in 1994 about the dark green Suburban parked near the access road, and had carried that detail in him for 28 years like a stone he couldn't put down, heard the news from his daughter. He went and sat on the back porch of the farmhouse, where he had lived his whole life, and looked out at the fields, and didn't say anything for a long time. Darren Voss pleaded guilty to first-degree murder in February 2024. In his plea, he disclosed the location of Judith Callan's remains, a tree line on an abandoned property 18 miles from the Hendershot Access Road, land that had been searched in October 1994 and missed. She had been there for 30 years. The Callan family was notified before the press. They were given time. Voss received a sentence of life in prison without parole. A soil sample that had sat untouched for 28 years in an evidence envelope with a handwritten notation that said possible organic material, surface of print margin, not identified, not submitted. Shed skin cells pressed into Nebraska farm dirt by a boot on an October morning in 1994. A brother's Christmas Dina kit in 2019. That was the chain. That was what closed it. Renee Callan Marsh drove out to the old farm the weekend after the sentencing. The land had changed hands twice since the sale. It was part of a larger consolidated operation now. The farmhouse gone. The fields running unbroken from road to road. The windbreak on the north side where she had buried Gus was still there. A thin line of cottonwoods and cedar. The new owners, when she called to ask, had said of course she could visit. They had been kind about it. She stood at the edge of the windbreak for a while. The October light came across flat and clear, the way her mother used to describe it from the cab of the combine. The best light of the year, she always said. The way it made the whole field look like it was finished rather than beginning. Judith Callan was 51 years old. She had 420 acres and a yellow lab named Gus, and a CB call sign that everyone in the county knew, and a daughter 6 miles away she talked to every morning, and in Northfield she was planning to finish by the end of that week. She had kept a farm running through grief when she had every reason not to. She had chosen every day to stay in the place that needed her and to be responsible for the people around her. She had a life that was not finished. She had a harvest that was not finished. She deserved to finish it. What stays with you after a case like this is not just the 30 years. It is the particular cruelty of the geography. A woman who made herself visible on purpose, who drove a red truck so people could see her coming, who broadcasted her location every morning on Channel 19 so that the community around her would know she was there. She had built a life of transparency in a landscape of open fields, and she was taken from the one blind spot in it, the 2 minutes between one farm road and the next when no one was looking. How many evidence envelopes and how many archives across this country have a handwritten notation that says not identified, not submitted? How many cases are sitting in boxes waiting for someone to make a third pass through the inventory? And what do we owe the people who never stopped making those calls? The Renees and the Patricias and the Dorothys who called every October and said, "I'm still here, and so is this." Tell us in the comments what you think. And tell us whether you believe a case like Judith's, 30 years, found because of a brother's curiosity about Scandinavian ancestry, changes how you think about justice and time. We'd like to know. Tell us where in the world you're watching from. Justice found Judith Callan after 30 years. Stories like hers are why this channel exists. If you believe the truth is worth pursuing no matter how long it takes, subscribe and find more solved cold cases waiting for you in the description below. Thank you for being here.